Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 310. This week the questions are taken from guide 386 on the LCVP or Higgins boat, the Wednesday video on the invention of the depth charge, and the Friday video on Puget Sound Navy Museum. So let's get on with questions. BK Zhong asks, did the Japanese ever try coming up with something similar to Fritz X, excluding the use of human pilots as guidance systems? Yes, they did, and no, they didn't. It depends how specific you want to be. So, in terms of did the Japanese have something like Fritz X, i.e. a massive, great, heavy armor-piercing freefall bomb with radio guidance? No. If you mean in terms of did the Japanese have some form of radio-controlled projectile weapons that they could try and use against enemy shipping that didn't require sticking a pilot in it, yes, they did. They also had a disturbingly large number of human-guided options, but they were also trying the non-human guided option. The thing you've got to remember is that whilst, generally speaking, Japanese radio and other technology was behind the Allies, in terms of things like radar and so forth, they weren't that far behind. What you see in World War II is partially technology advancing in this area really, really fast, and partially Japan just not having as large a manufacturing base, and then, of course, towards the end of the war, B-29s doing something of a number on what manufacturing base Japan still had. So by the end of the war, the Japanese arguably were producing radar sets that were probably better than the majority of radar that was available to the US at the start of the Pacific War, and that had only been 3.5 years ago. But of course, by that point, the US and latterly with the UK, when it showed up in numbers, had not only been advancing quite considerably, but also mass manufacturing what they had. And you can kind of see that in the development of radio-guided weaponry. The US actually actively had first-generation radio-guided weaponry in service, as of course did the Germans. The British were experimenting but didn't see quite as much pressure. So although they were capable of making similar levels of weapons, they just didn't really get around to it. The Japanese, on the other hand, were basically in the testing phase for a number of their weapons. Some were conversions of existing aircraft, but two in particular that stand out amongst a admittedly relatively small range of programs are what you're seeing on the screen at the moment, the IGO weapon, also known as the KI-148, and this is more like an HS-293 than a Fritz X, i.e. it is as you might be able to tell from the attached rocket motor and wings, more of a guided missile than a guided bomb. It's only about half the weight of Fritz X, if that. But unlike the HS-293, which only carried a blast warhead and was therefore only suitable for attacking small craft and merchant ships, the IGO actually came in two different flavors. One had a big blast warhead, which made it very analogous to the HS-293, but the other one did actually have an armor-piercing warhead, which theoretically would give it a similar capability to a Fritz X, but from a different attack profile. The Fritz X obviously coming in as close to vertical as it could, whereas this thing obviously would be coming in from a much shallower angle and thus likely to engage different portions of a ship's main protection. And the other one, which at least visually might appear to be more along the lines of a Japanese Fritz X, is the Kego. I believe that's how it's pronounced. You can see how it's spelt up there at the top. And this is a guided bomb, or more specifically, this is actually a self-guiding bomb. Unlike Fritz X, which is steered from a mothership, and IGO was also supposed to be steered by a mothership, this thing, which again was about half the mass of a Fritz X, was supposed to find targets on its own using an infrared seeker up front. Now, of course, infrared seeking technology was pretty primitive at the end of World War II, and so test results were mixed. the overall efficacy of the Seekerhead was held to be pretty good, but only at night. And to be fair, the Japanese did predict that during the day, reflected sunlight and therefore heat off of the ocean might result in the Seeker going a little bit crazy, which did tend to happen. But they found that at night, it was actually pretty good at homing in on heat sources, like, say, ships' funnels or ships generally. But much like the Igo, this was only in initial testing at the end of the war, greatly delayed by, obviously, the various carpet bombing missions that the Allies were conducting. Otherwise, it's theoretically possible that Igo and Kego might just about have reached initial operational deployment status by the very, very end of the war. Not that it would have made a huge amount of difference, but it would have been interesting. Keeperman asks, I seem to remember you mentioned in a video about how many destroyers should escort a battleship, and I think you said around 16. Can you expand on this if that was indeed the correct number? Was this achieved, and in a battle group or task force, did the numbers change, or did you simply add numbers together? So there's a difference between what's ideal and also what each navy views as ideal, and what is actually achievable in reality. So, for example, and I apologize slightly for the lower res here, but here's a scan from actually a 1940 fleet problem. So this is for the escort of a battleship division from the US Navy. You can see the battleships there represented by the arrows. And you'll notice that even if we disregard the outer picket line, purely in terms of the close screen, you can see that the screen is made up of, on the sides and up front, a series of pairs of light and or heavy cruisers, depending on which section you're looking at, each paired with 2 destroyers. And then at the back we have multiple pairs of destroyers, and then moving inside even closer still, we have some isolated light cruisers, but the 4 light cruisers in the rear arc are each paired with another destroyer. And then right up close with the battleships, there's actually 2 entire destroyer squadrons, Desron 3 at the front and Desron 6 at the back. So again, ignoring the picket screen, you have 24 destroyers, 24, around the battleship division, and then 2 entire destroyer squadrons actually with them. Plus, if you look really carefully, there's a carrier in there that has another couple of destroyers attached to it. Now, was the US actually able to escort a fleet formation with, 40 plus destroyers once you take into account the pickets? In World War II, at the beginning, no. They didn't have anywhere near that many free destroyers. And obviously, once the war got going in 1942, destroyers were dropping like flies. Whereas towards the end of the war, they had considerably more than that in terms of destroyers and destroyer escorts around any given fleet, such as, for example, at the Battle of Iwo Jima. But where the 16 number comes from is that essentially, in an ideal world, if you're escorting something big and valuable like a capital ship against any possible threat, air or submarine, then you would want 4 destroyers right up close, essentially in a diamond formation. So 1 ahead, 1 immediately behind, 1 to each side. Or depending on the preference of the commander, you could have them at 4 points. So you could have 1 to forward port, forward starboard, aft port and aft starboard. But essentially those are your absolute close-in last-ditch defense, primarily there for anti-aircraft support, but they can also hunt submarines that have slipped through your outer screen. And then you have the outer screen, and that's just a matter of physics being ruthless. If you have an outer screen, bearing in mind that your close-in ships aren't going to be within a stone's throw, but your outer screen is going to have to cover a massively larger perimeter, and for that, essentially the minimum you can really get away with is 3 to port, 3 to starboard, 3 ahead, and 3 behind. That, in theory, using early sonar systems, lookouts, and of course air search radar, should give you a line where you will at least be able to detect and possibly engage any submarine or aircraft that tries to cross that outer line. And if you're not fast enough, or you miss your target with depth charges or anything, then your inner destroyers will be able to try and work and get rid of the target instead. But, as I said, this is an ideal. It's very rarely, if ever, achieved. You have multiple cases of capital ships going along with far fewer escorts. In fact, you have multiple capital ships going along with far fewer destroyers and destroyer escorts available when you just don't have as many. You just have to take risks of accepting that you don't have an ideal escort screen and position your escorts either far enough away and hope that the enemy doesn't slip through the gaps, or closer in and accept the fact the enemy might be either in or almost in a firing position by the time you detect them. The thing is, once you start adding multiple capital ships into the equation, your ideal numbers don't actually scale quite as quickly. So your ideal numbers for escorting 4 battleships or 8 battleships or 6 battleships and 4 carriers aren't necessarily 6, 8 or 10 times 16, because that outer screen is determined more so by the engagement time you need to shoot an aircraft and all the the engagement time you need for submarines outside of the submarine's torpedo range. Within that space, you can actually fit a fair number of capital ships if they're all relatively closely spaced together. So your absolute close-in screen, your last-ditch screen, might increase slightly, but the outer screen won't increase a huge amount, as you can kind of see by the fact that even this particular escort force, which is supposed to escort a carrier and 4 battle divisions, is actually only a little bit over twice as many as that which you would theoretically want to escort a single capital unit. Niels Larson asks, if you had to design a naval-themed chess set, how would you represent the different pieces? I think that would actually be quite difficult, mostly because if you think about typical chess pieces, they're vertical. Ships tend to be horizontal and obviously, proportionally speaking, quite slim compared to their length, which would make them very hard to represent on a general chessboard. Even if you put them on sort of circular bases that filled the square, you'd still be looking at some very, very small models, which would be fairly delicate and actually fairly difficult to ascertain what they were, unless you either knew your naval history very, very particularly, which I suppose if you're picking up a naval-themed chess set you might be, or you had really, really good eyesight, which means I think you'd probably have to end up using naval personnel, because then you could do little busts of everybody. So you'd use probably a general sailor for the pawns. The castles, I think you probably end up using maybe a petty officer. The bishops, well, ships have chaplains, so you can do that quite easily. The knights, or the horses, depending on what you want to call them, I think maybe because of obviously the implication of speed, cavalry, like maybe you'd want to use pilots, also again visually distinctive. And for the king and the queen, you probably use an admiral and a captain. Now, if you had perhaps a fun-sized chessboard, i.e. want something that is maybe each square is twice as large as a normal chessboard, then you might be able to start thinking about models that are big enough to be visually distinguishable as ships, at which point you'd use maybe destroyers for the pawns, maybe light cruisers for the horses or knights, heavy cruisers for the castles, maybe submarines for the bishops, although you could switch those last 2 around, and then maybe a battleship and an aircraft carrier, in which one uses the king, which one uses the queen. I'll leave up to you. Although I would suspect that maybe going for the dreadnought, pre-dreadnought crossover period, i.e. the mid-1900s, might give you some more visually distinctive designs you could use rather than the World War II period. And I think maybe you might also end up going with a slightly out of proportion model set, i.e. with artificially wider beams, again, just to make the models a bit larger and easier to recognise. Brendan Buersdorf asks, did the Germans have any viable designs for landing craft for Operation Sea Lion? Technically speaking, yes. At the time that Sea Lion was vaguely meant to happen, they had a type of boat which is roughly analogous to as one of the smaller LCTs, that's landing craft tank, not LST, the much larger landing ship tank. But we are literally talking, fewer than you can count on two working hands. Most of the rest of their invasion force consisted of, if you were lucky, stuff like this Siebel ferry, which is, just what it looks like. It's a catamaran ferry. But a lot of the rest of it was barges, converted barges of varying descriptions, most of which, well, in fact, pretty much all of which, when it comes to the barges, couldn't actually make the channel crossing. They would have to be towed. Some of them had engines, and some of them just didn't have engines at all. Quite exactly how they were planning on getting the engineless ones to actually go ashore appears to be something that they were hoping they'd figure out later. At least the powered ones, even though their engines weren't capable of taking them across the channel, could in theory make a short hop from the deep draft towing vessel to the shore, but still they only had riverine rated engines. I guess in theory you would try and get them to tow the unpowered barges in, but at that point, given they're already low power and some of the rather vicious riptides and currents you can get off the southeast English shores, you very well may have had the rather comical sight of assuming that somehow this working cavalcade of nonsense made its way across the channel. A particularly vicious riptide just carrying the invasion force off somewhere else, much to the bemusement of the British troops defending. And given that there aren't that many viable beaches on the southeast of England, that may have ended up with the bulk of Operation Sea Lion just being smashed up against a cliff or something by, well, the fairly regular times and tides and winds that you get in the English Channel. Sea Lion was not a particularly well thought out plan. If you were lucky, you might be stuck on a little rubber dinghy or a small 4 to 6 man lightweight wooden powerboat. And I'm not even joking. Literally lightweight little wooden powerboat with an outboard motor. Yeah, the survivability of those, considering that when they were used operationally elsewhere, a not insignificant percentage of them got overwhelmed by the elements, there is a fairly decent chance that any kind of significant chop might well again have decimated the small amount of actually powered, self-propelled landing craft that could theoretically otherwise have made it to shore. And of course, large units like the Siebel ferry, well, at least the Allied landing craft had the good graces to have some sides that you could at least up armour, if obviously in the large ones they weren't already armoured already, to be at least bulletproof, as opposed to, here is a very large flat surface on which we have arrayed a wide variety of squishy and or flammable objects, please shoot at them with as many small arms as you can get your hands on, which appears to be the German approach to amphibious landings. So, yeah, theoretically there are a handful of designs that are actually half decent as seagoing amphibious assault craft that the Germans did come up with. However, at the time of Operation Sea Lion, they literally do not exist outside of a very, very few test units. The things like the F-lighters that you would later see, which obviously are seaworthy as they were used in the Mediterranean, most of their construction post at date Sea Lion, even if the planning for them was related to Sea Lion. The more and more I look into what the Germans were actually thinking of moving their troops and vehicles in outside of some of the larger converted ships, which I guess we would either run ashore and they're like full-size ships, or sit offshore and hope that you can offload onto smaller craft for human transportation, the more and more I'm convinced that as much as the Royal Navy had all these fancy plans for defending against Sea Lion, the entire operation, even if the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force had just decided to stay at home that day, could, at the turn of some fairly common weather events on the southern English coast, have turned into possibly the single largest and most comical disaster known to mankind, at which point the Home Guard and the regular British Army units acting as beach and clifftop defence may actually have had to turn into humanitarian rescue parties after, 90% of the landing forces get swept along the shore and smashed into rocks. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, I recently stumbled across images of the automobile or fish torpedo from 1871 and models of USS Holland SS1, and it surprises me that they both appear to have a quartz nozzle, despite the quartz nozzle not being invented for another 60 years. Is this another WW2 situation where someone unwittingly invents something decades ahead of its time, but doesn't necessarily realise it? So what's being referred to here, a quartz nozzle, is, if you look at this torpedo, the automobile or fish torpedo, or automobile, whatever you want to call it, it's essentially the shroud around the propeller. And if you look at models of the USS Holland, you'll see a similar thing, albeit somewhat smaller proportionally. Now, I don't necessarily think this is precisely a quartz nozzle, because one of the key things for the improvements you get, especially at low speed, which would make more sense for the submarine than necessarily for the torpedo, is that the shroud has to have a foil cross-section, i.e. it looks a little bit like an aeroplane wing. I strongly suspect, obviously I haven't investigated the automobile fish torpedo, if it's even still around, because I don't know where that might be, but having looked at a few other early torpedoes that have a similar shroud ring, and one or two submarines as well for that matter, I don't recall their shroud rings having a foil shape. They're much more just a curved strip of metal. So although there may be some small benefits in terms of hydrodynamics, I'm not sure that they are fully representative of a quartz nozzle. However, of course, for those of you who may be deep investigators into the intricacies of the propulsion of early torpedoes and submarines, if there was anybody who stuck a specifically foil or potentially even accidentally foil shaped or just slightly not perfectly cylindrical nozzle on a torpedo or a sub, do let us know in the comments below. But there would have been other reasons for why you would put such a thing on a sub or a torpedo. With the torpedo particularly, it would serve to protect the propeller as the torpedo is being launched, because obviously as it's going out of its tube or its slide, it either starts to tip or enter the water, or any kind of change of attitude, there's a chance the propeller therefore would be smacked against something. The shroud means that's not going to happen. And more generally underwater, both for small subs like the Holland or the torpedo in this case, the shroud will also, again, if you're operating a little too close to comfort to the seabed, hopefully protect you from rocks and bits and pieces, but also more generally in terms of, random bits of debris and lines that might be in the water, ropes and so forth, the shroud hopefully protects you somewhat there. And also, as you can see with the torpedo, it's obviously got to be connected to something, so the whole setup will probably also have a little bit of a stabilizing / guidance effect on the torpedo, not in terms of actually making it go anywhere other than in a dead straight line, but perhaps helping to keep it in a dead straight line, and similarly with the sub. Also on the older Holland type subs, you tend to quite often see them being used as a mounting point for both rudders and planes. Alex Moskowitz asks, would it have been theoretically possible for a ship with a net to capture a submarine and receive prize money for it? Given that the idea of actually, full-on catching a submarine in a net and hauling it around, as opposed to just putting up anti-submarine nets to prevent them from getting places, was very much a thing in World War I, and in World War I prize money was technically still being paid out. Yes, it would in theory be possible for a ship with a net to catch a sub, and then if you can haul it up or at least keep it pinned in place to a degree that it is captured, then of course, yeah, you've captured an enemy warship. You would get prize money for that. The only note of caution that I would put down is, look at what happens to modern fishing vessels when they occasionally accidentally catch a modern submarine. Now, granted, of course, modern submarines are far more powerful in terms of their propulsion systems and far larger, often massively outmassing the fishing vessels that they capture. So the fishing vessels either end up being dragged under, or if they're lucky, taken on a bit of a Nantucket sleigh ride before they cut their lines or the net breaks. But with that said, the vast majority of World War I anti-submarine vessels tended to be trawlers and other small vessels, which, even compared to a lot of modern fishing ships, were not very large at all. And whilst, let's say, German U-boats, obviously proportionally much smaller and less powerful engine-wise than a modern nuclear-powered attack sub, still displaced more and had more engine power than quite a number of anti-submarine warfare vessels of the First World War. So there could be actually quite some inherent risk of an anti-submarine trawler, for example, trying to haul in a U-boat. It might end up being the thing being sunk instead. However, if you used something like World War I era Flower class sloop, that probably is just about large enough and powerful enough to haul a sub around and decide, right, you're coming in with me for some prize money. Cat Nibbles asks, when did air-dropped depth charges get developed? Actually, right at the start of the depth charge story, behold the Type C depth charge, or early airborne depth charge. As you can see, it's kind of shaped like a small bomb, and that's because it pretty much is a small bomb, just with the capability of exploding deep underwater, either using a very basic hydrostatic pistol, or, as you can see in this diagram, a little float with a preset line. So go down to whatever depth the line is, the float obviously staying on the surface, and then click boom. They didn't work very well, and they didn't get used all that much because, well, it adds all the problems of level bombing a target, combined with the fact that a submarine is not particularly a large target, combined with then having to calculate not only for the airdrop, but also then it sinking through the water. And at the end of it all, because it's obviously going to be carried by a World War I era aircraft, it's not particularly large or heavy, therefore it can't carry all that much explosive, therefore its lethal radius is not quite non-existent, but it's almost non-existent. You essentially have to put the thing right down on top of your target, ideally a direct hit or very close to, in order to actually do anything, hence why it wasn't particularly successful. And then, of course, in the interwar period, as depth charges were refined, they invented still smaller than full-sized ones originally, but considerably larger than this thing, which were then taken and put into the air during the Second World War, where they proved somewhat more effective. Andre de Coult asks, which effect of a depth charge's explosion causes the most damage and is the hardest to build against? The initial explosion's expansion, the post-explosion implosion, the combination of the two, or something else? Trying to walk this through from an engineering perspective, I think for obvious reasons, the answer is going to depend quite a lot on operational depth of the sub and where it is in relation to that depth when the depth charge goes off. Because obviously if the sub is at or slightly beyond its test depth, obviously we know that submarines in World War II did exceed their test depths at points under extreme duress, then obviously the hull is the pressure hull is under absolutely massive strain, very, very close to rupturing, at which point a depth charge that can reach that deep, or which explodes very slightly further up the water column, but the shockwave is enough to reach the sub, then obviously that is going to cause the most damage, because that's going to be just enough increased pressure to tip things over the edge, and suddenly, crunch goes the sub. But outside of those circumstances, if we're assuming a nearby explosion as opposed to, the depth charge landing right on or scraping down the side of the sub, then the implosion, I would suspect, is actually going to be the thing that is going to be the hardest thing to design against. Now, obviously, you've got a whole combination of factors. You have the initial explosion, the implosion, and shockwaves resulting thereafter as you get a whole series of them. But assuming that you are, let's say, halfway down your column of water, which from the surface to your test depth, the initial shockwave of the explosion is an increase in pressure, effectively. As you know, there's obviously a actual traveling shockwave as well, but generally speaking, what you're talking about is dealing with increased pressure wherever that happens to be coming from. Now, of course, the submarine's pressure hull is designed to deal with extreme pressures, and so whilst you're increasing the pressure in a particular location, you are essentially working with the submarine in terms of what it is supposed to be doing, how the hull is supposed to be behaving. Obviously, the aim of the depth charge is to exceed that pressure, and therefore you get a rupture. But simply by designing a sub to dive deep, you are, to a certain degree, reducing the lethal radius of depth charges. The implosion, however, assuming that it is close enough for this to affect the submarine in terms of a change in local pressure, is going to be somewhat harder for the sub's hull to be designed against, specifically, because, of course, now you're pulling a portion of the sub out, effectively. I mean, if you're at any considerable depth, there's still going to be a degree of pressure, but not as much as the pressure elsewhere on the sub. Therefore, effectively, it's a pulling force. And, of course, any internal cross-bracing that might help resist pressure, framing, etc., isn't going to be much help against that. Whatever is attaching the submarine's frame to its pressure hull, whether that be rivets or welds or whatever, is the only thing that's going to be dealing with that, and those generally don't do quite as well in tension as they do in compression, although it does vary, obviously, depending on the method, the materials, and the time period. But also, because when you have the initial explosion, the expansion wave, you have essentially pressure and more pressure pushing in, whereas within the implosion, you've got pressure pushing in and then negative pressure pulling out. You could potentially, depending on the explosion, the size of it, location, etc., could actually have a shearing force, quite a considerable shearing force from opposing motions being caused to the pressure hull itself. And either on joints or on the material, depending again on where this explosion is occurring, that could have significantly more detrimental effects that, again, are much harder to design against than just the initial pressure wave. Now, of course, that in and of itself could cause a hull failure, or it could cause plastic deformation, even if small, within the hull, the pressure hull, which then subsequent pressure waves, etc., or even just the pressure of the ocean once it stabilizes, may then be able to exploit. Obviously, with every explosion-implosion cycle, you are losing energy, so the total amount of energy being exerted on the sub's hull will be less in pretty much every stage, apart from the initial explosion expansion point, and therefore purely in terms of numbers, that should be the thing that causes the most damage. But as said, because you're kind of working with the way the sub is designed in terms of the second part of the question, which is what's the harder part to design against, I think actually that shearing and or torsion effect, again, depending on the location of the explosion or implosion at this point, would actually be slightly harder to design your sub to resist. Gord M asks, have you visited the 4 remaining World War II U-boats as museum pieces? And do you have any idea how many diveable World War II wrecks exist? So far, I have visited 2 of the 4 U-boats. That's U-505, obviously in Chicago, and U-534 in Liverpool, although technically it's on the other side of the river there. Now, in terms of the other 2 remaining ones, the Electra boat and the Type 7, which are both in Germany, I have not visited those, although I am tentatively hoping to visit those next year. And the reason I haven't visited those up until now is that way back, 3-4 years ago, just before COVID, actually, when I was looking at the possibility of visiting them, and also actually even before I ran the channel, I wanted to visit them. Back then, they had a very, very restrictive policy around photography and filming, which was basically you can't. And then later on it was, well, you can, but we're not going to let you use any of it. So I could go and visit the thing. I could take a bunch of stuff for personal research, but as far as using it on the channel, no, I couldn't. Post-COVID, I've been advised by a few people that the terms and conditions have changed and that you can actually photograph and film, at least to a limited degree, on those vessels and use what you've done publicly. But because it's been, a while and I've had other places to visit, I haven't revisited the idea yet. So if any of you are in Germany and actually know what the exact status is of the two subs in terms of, well, obviously you can visit, but in terms of can you take video and film and will they let you use that elsewhere, then obviously please let me know, because then I can work out whether or not it's actually worth me specifically taking my time to go and visit them to report back to you guys what they're like, as opposed to maybe having it in as just something nice for me to do while I'm on my way to somewhere else. In terms of diveable wrecks, I'm assuming by the context of the question you mean diveable U-boat wrecks. Depending on your capacity as a diver, and so I'm assuming you don't own a mini sub, for example, but depending on the capacity of a diver, whether you can just do open water or advanced open water, i.e. are you diving on just compressed air, or are you going on heliox or trimix, or that kind of stuff. As far as I'm aware, there's somewhere between 40 and 50 diveable U-boat wrecks at the moment, or at least that are listed at the moment. Obviously, they are occasionally finding more. Most, if you the single largest grouping of diveable U-boats are off British coastlines, somewhat understandably. The next most prolific is off the American northeast coast, and then there's a handful scattered around elsewhere, including almost half a dozen off the coast of France. And of course, as I said, as they discover more wrecks, and once more, depending on what your capability as a diver is and what kind of support craft you have, those exact figures as to how many diveable wrecks there are may vary somewhat, because a really advanced diver with a lot of expensive equipment who has a full-scale support craft would be able to go both into deeper water but also further out from the coast, and therefore that would open up more wrecks than just the ones on the coastline, for example. Napalm asks, please explain the somewhat quizzical practice of icebound ships dropping anchors. Essentially, you can divide up ships that are stopping because they're trapped in ice into roughly 3 categories. There are further subdivisions of this, but roughly speaking, you can have a ship that's stopped because it's surrounded by ice, which, if you have a look at this painting here of, I think this is Erebus, that's roughly what you're looking at, i.e. there's ice all around the ship, but there is still a degree of open water, at which point you could drift with the current, at which point obviously you would want to anchor. Then you could have the ship actually hemmed in by ice, but the ice is loose ice, at which point, again, you would want to anchor, because the floating ice, as it bumps against your ship, obviously driven by the currents, could drive your ship in a direction you don't want it to go and carry your ship away, which you, again, don't want to happen. And this, this can occur either if it's loose ice just traveling around fairly rapidly, or if you're properly stuck in ice that is still, even though it might be sort of horizon to horizon white, is still made up of lots of individual pieces, because the ice will move and you might not necessarily want to move. Now, if you deploy your anchor, that's not, strictly speaking, going to stop you from being moved by that amount of ice. It may just pick you up and take it with you anyway, but at least the anchor is going to drag, which might slow down your rate of progress, and some of the ice might flow past you. And then finally, if the ship is completely frozen, solid in ice, again, horizon to horizon white, and either it's just frozen up because the temperature has dropped so low, or perhaps there was a whole load of pack ice and it's now all frozen together again because the temperature has dropped. Well, at that point, you're not going to be able to drop an anchor through the ice unless it's, for some bizarre reason, really thin. But assuming you had dropped your anchor beforehand, again, for similar reasons, you are trying to prevent your ship from being dragged around, because ice will go pretty much where it wants to, and that can include ashore. And if the ice is, even if it's solid, if your ship is relatively robust and the ice isn't too thick, it might still be walk-onable, but not massively overly thick, then your ship might still kind of forge its way slowly through the ice or be dragged less. Obviously, once the ice gets too thick and it decides to move, well, it doesn't really matter if you had an anchor down at that point anyway. The ship's going to be taken wherever the ice wants to go, although at that point it may very well just crush the ship anyway. Dave Collier asks, can you tell us a bit about Graham Island, also known as Isola, Ferdinandea, or Il Giulia, and its multiple flag-raising ceremonies? So Graham Island in the Mediterranean, because there is also a Graham Island off the west coast of Canada, is essentially a small volcano that's still active. Bear in mind its nearest landmass is Sicily, which is known for a variety of rather interesting active volcanoes like Etna. And it periodically erupts enough that part of the volcanic top manages to breach the sea, and then as the eruption stops, the sea washes that away and it recedes beneath the sea again. This has apparently happened several times in its history, but the bit that I believe he's asking about is in 1831. Now, as I said, it does sit closest to Sicily, but it sits about a third of the way between Sicily and the closest tip of Tunisia. So right in the straits that control pretty much all east-west traffic in the Mediterranean, unless you want to dare the straits between Sicily and Italy. Now, when it erupted in 1831, it actually grew fairly quickly and fairly substantially, to the point that people thought this might be a permanent island. Now, being within visual range of Sicily, unsurprisingly the then Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, because this predated Italy as a unified country. Well, firstly, a Sicilian customs officer wandered out and said, hey, this belongs to Sicily. However, he made a strategic error and didn't bring a flag with him, which meant that very shortly thereafter, a British first rate rocked up, and the British looked at it and went, well, it's, as I said, almost slap bang in the middle of the major trade lanes. If this island sticks around, this would make an excellent naval base from which to watch-press everybody. And so they landed, and they did have a flag. So they planted their flag and said, well, this island now belongs to us. The Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, realising pretty much the same thing that the British had, and in fact everyone realising this, then sent out a proper warship to make their own claim, which then showed up after the British. So technically the Sicilians had claimed it both before and after Britain, although officially in terms of actual government dispatch afterwards. And then obviously again, because massive strategic implications, the Spanish and the French decided that they were going to get stuck into the action as well, albeit somewhat later than everybody else. Although it's not exactly clear as to whether or not the Spanish actually got around to planting their flag on there, unlike the British, the Sicilians, and the French. They just said, hey, we'd like a bit of that as well. Now, this was shaping up to be a proper European scrap, as everybody decided they wanted a piece of this island, or the whole thing, and they were potentially willing to fight a small war over it, and then the whole thing was put to one side because the eruption stopped. The island turned out to be made up of very loose volcanic rock, and it was very quickly washed away, so everyone was still arguing over who got to own the island as the island disappeared beneath the waves again. And nowadays, it's kind of stayed underwater. There have been a few eruptions since, but nothing that's managed to get the island to come back out of the Mediterranean again. And nowadays, the Italians, because now the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies is part of the much larger Kingdom of Italy, Republic of Italy now, I think, has officially preemptively laid claim to it should it arise again. although whether it'll kick off yet another round of territorial disputes, I don't know. ConeLed asks, in the July Patreon Drydock, you talked about how European ship construction improved to allow for larger ships. Can you talk about how Chinese ship construction allowed for them to build significantly larger vessels than Europe had in the 14th and 15th century, and potentially some of the engineering behind them? Well, of course, this gets into the whole argument of exactly how large the Chinese treasure ships of Zheng He's, I think that's how it's pronounced, fleet actually were. And, there's all sorts of arguments pinging back and forth, but even the more common lower end estimates would indicate ships that were a little bit larger in the early 14th century than the largest European galleons would be in the early 16th century. So obviously in the 14th and early 15th centuries, they would be significantly larger than contemporary European vessels. How much larger is, of course, the big argument. Did Europe catch up by the 16th century, or did they not really catch up until the 19th century? In any case, personally, I don't think the slightly larger estimates of 450 feet plus are necessarily accurate. Before, I was on the fence, but more recently I've read about the excavations of the actual shipyards where the treasure fleet was supposed to have been built, and based on the physical dimensions of the docks and the support frames for ship construction that were found there, that's fairly direct. I tend to think that you're probably looking at ships maybe 250 to 280 feet long for the biggest ships, which is still pretty darn big. I mean, you're still looking at a vessel that would be substantially longer than pretty much any ship at the Battle of Trafalgar, for instance. As for how they managed it engineering-wise, well, the Chinese did introduce a form of watertight bulkhead, which gives the ship a little bit of additional structural strength. If you look at the various proposed models and replicas, you'll also notice that if you compare them to European ships of the time, the hulls, I wouldn't say they're more rectangular, but they're much fuller than European vessels, which makes them slightly less well designed in terms of sheer outright speed, but pushes them more in the direction of almost barge-like construction. They're not, they are still ships, but they're more towards a barge-like hull form, and a barge-like hull form, especially when you're building out of wood, is just significantly stronger, so you could make it significantly larger, especially once you have internal framing, as compared to a hull form that's designed more for speed than it is for just sheer load-bearing capability. Most of the depictions also tend to lack particularly high, what we would call forecastles or stern castles, which is, of course, saved weight and saved stability, and less weights acting at the very ends of the ship, so that will generally improve the ship's handling and structural strength and durability generally. And also, ultimately, we are talking about Ming China, so in the words of that wonderful long-term resident of the internet, Despair.com, you can do anything when you set your mind to, if you have vision, determination, and an endless supply of expendable labour. Sapper Ninja asks, I just watched the movie Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. A documentary it was not, however it was good fun. I agree. It was very funny. Would you mind briefly talking through the real Operation Postmaster, and would you consider doing a video on it one day? Yeah, Postmaster's definitely on the list at some point, although it's one of those things that's, to be honest, so hilarious in reality, it's almost a match for the movie in terms of hilarity and ridiculousness, so that's going to be an interesting one to go through without having random people come out of the woodwork accusing me of exaggerating things, because of course, as we all know, reality is often stranger than fiction. Now, the real Operation Postmaster takes place just off the coast of Africa. Now, if you imagine Africa generally as a map, you've got the westmost portion of Africa, which kind of sticks out and comes along on a mostly east-west coast, and then it takes a sharp turn and the southern part of Africa heads south. Now, at that corner, if you like, at the border between what's now Nigeria and Cameroon, if you zoom in on Google Maps, you'll see an island called Bioko. It's a relatively large island. That used to belong to Spain, and it went by a different name. It was called Fernando Po at the time. And back in the early part of the Second World War, what we would now term special forces, before they were all grouped together under fewer designations, the small-scale raiding force, special operations executive, and at the time you had the long-range desert group, and so on and so forth. Anyway, so British special forces were dispatched to the general area of Central West Africa because of concerns that the Germans were using Vichy French ports and rivers as U-boat bases, which wasn't necessarily a completely unfounded concern, because U-boats had been caught using Vichy French facilities in the Caribbean occasionally. But, as it turned out, either the Germans weren't using these facilities or the Special Forces investigations weren't able to prove it. Either way, they didn't find any German U-boats hovering in West African rivers or small West African ports. So, at something of a loss of what to do, they did notice that over on this Spanish-held island, there was a trio of Italian and German ships, the largest of which was this vessel, the Duchessa d'Aosta, and they were a bit worried about these. Now, they didn't seem to have any particularly valuable cargo, although it's possible the Duchess d'Aosta was carrying some form of ammunition. What they were worried about, however, was the fact that she had a functional radio, which meant, of course, that she could report what Allied shipping was doing, as there was quite a lot, actually, of Allied shipping going up and down the west coast of Africa. And so, after some resistance from the British officials in the local area, the Special Forces were eventually granted 2 tugs and some additional men, and with the help of a British agent in the harbour itself, they set about their plan. So what they did is the agent ashore in the harbour held a party for the officers of the 3 ships, the 3 Axis ships that were in harbour. So there was very minimal numbers of men aboard those vessels. And so when the 2 tugs came into harbour, they rapidly boarded and overpowered the minimal crew who were on the ships. Then they set explosives, which blew the anchor chains. And then the tugs took the ships in tow. So one tug took the Duchess d'Aosta in tow, the other 2 smaller vessels were towed by a single tug, and they just sailed out of harbour. And everyone in the harbour looked on and was like, that's weird. What's going on? And by the time they realised anything was going on, it was far too late to do anything about it. Then, for plausible deniability reasons, because of course neither the tugs nor the Special Forces were in any way, shape or form flagged as British, a British corvette had been dispatched to the local area, which then just so happened to intercept the tug and the Duchess d'Aosta out in international waters. And of course, well, it's an Axis vessel in international waters, we're going to capture it, thanks very much. The other tug with the 2 smaller ships ended up having some engine problems and was then towed in by a neutral third party to a port, well, which is now in Nigeria, Lagos, Nigeria. And the British swore absolutely blind they had nothing to do with it. The Spanish, of course, said this is piracy, but didn't really take anything any further than that. The ships that were captured ended up being used in different parts of the world, obviously by British lines, although quite a lot of the Special Forces actually active in the seizure of the ships would later be killed in action. So there wasn't ultimately, at the end of the war, a tremendous number of Special Forces who'd been involved in the action who could then talk about it afterwards. Dr. D.M. Platt asks, in the vein that the Espana-class battleships can be thought of as baby's first battleship, what carrier, heavy, light cruiser, destroyer, escort, etc. would be babies first, for example? Well, obviously this isn't a chronological question, it's more a relative size compared to other similar vessels. So in that vein, I would probably go with Hermes as Baby's first carrier. It is a relatively early vessel, and unlike some other small carriers that you could point at, Argus, Hosho, the Independences, etc., Hermes is purpose-built as a carrier, which I think is probably a stronger candidate, therefore, than some of the conversions. And due to her relatively substantial island, she also looks like what you would imagine a carrier to look like if your only exposure to aircraft carriers has been perhaps seeing the more modern types. And obviously she's still pretty small. For heavy cruisers, I mean, there's not actually a lot of competition in that particular field, but I would probably go with the York class, again, because relative to all other heavy cruisers, they're one of the very few heavy cruiser types built deliberately massively below the treaty limits. So compared to the Japanese, Italians and Germans, who are determined to go well beyond the treaty limits, the rest of the British designs, as well as the American and French, which were around about the treaty limits, the Yorks are massively smaller. Light cruisers are an interesting one because there's actually a lot more light cruisers substantially below the treaty limits. You've got, obviously, the Arethusas and Leanders. You've got almost any Italian and French light cruiser, the Aganos. But I think if you were going to make a little plushy toy and say this is Baby's first light cruiser, I think either if you classify the Capitani Romanis as light cruisers, you might want to go for them. Otherwise, if you think they're more overblown super destroyers, then I would go for the Atlanta class. And in favour of having a very nice, spiky and interesting looking plushie, then I might go for the Atlantas anyway. And for destroyers, I'd actually probably go for the French Adouat class. They're torpilleurs, relatively small, but very distinctively, definitely destroyers. How many Blackburns could a Blackburn burn if a Blackburn could burn Blackburns? Asks, I know that Thames Ironworks and Shipbuilding Company closed in 1912 as a result of no new orders in their yards for building capital ships, but I have heard that there were others. So my question is, what other capital ship-capable shipbuilding yards closed in the UK during the Anglo-German naval arms race? What was the date that they closed? And if possible, what were the dimensions of the slipways and dry docks in those yards? Well, there's a mix of companies. Often assets will be acquired by other companies, and there's a few royal dockyards as well. So, for example, Chatham had a slipway that was more than capable of taking dreadnoughts, at least the early ones, well over 600 foot long, that slipway, but they decided not to build any dreadnoughts there. There's the Morday, Carney and Company based in Southampton, and according to Lloyd's Register, they have the Windsor Patent Slipway No. 1, which is 900 feet long, and yet at the start of the dreadnought race, just as dreadnoughts being laid down, there's so few battleship orders coming through compared to the sheer number of British yards capable of building them that they go under, and they are acquired by Thornycroft, and they have another similarly long slipway in Cardiff, again obviously acquired by Thornycroft. The D&W Henderson and Company yards in Glasgow, although they didn't go under during the dreadnought race, they were suffering at that point. They were taken over by Harland and Wolff very shortly after the First World War, because obviously contract came through during the First World War, and they possessed a 600-foot slipway. Likewise, also in Glasgow, A&J Inglis had an 850-foot slipway. Again, no orders acquired by Harland and Wolff in the aftermath of the First World War. And that's just a small sampling of shipyards that had large slipways, not counting graving docks and dry docks, where you could also build ships and just float them out instead of launching them. And when you go into either companies that severely struggled and went under shortly after, because obviously if they're struggling during the dreadnought arms race, they get a bit of a boost in the arm during World War I and then immediately go under as the orders dry up again. There's a lot more to look at there, as well as obviously shipyards that were taken over by bigger companies, which obviously the physical slipways don't go out of use, but the company that was owning them does, etc., etc. The unfortunate thing is there are so many British yards at that point and so many slipways, it would actually take a very long time to go through every single one of them. Plus, you'd have to go through, from 1905 to 1914, every year's copy of Lloyd's Register to see which companies have appeared or disappeared. It's a bit of work. The Rogue Chief asks, do you have any resource recommendations for 19th century naval gun development, particularly concerning the Parrott rifles or Dahlgrens? Most of what I find covers land artillery for the most part. And speaking of Victorian guns, which would you rather be standing next to upon firing, an early or copycat Parrott or an early Armstrong breechloader? Well, I'm definitely going to stand next to the Armstrong because the Armstrongs tend to have a pretty known failure mode, the breech block jumping out, which means that there's a relatively defined blast radius, as it were. So if I'm standing well forward or possibly back of that, I should be okay, but probably given the angle forward is better. Whereas if I'm standing next to a Parrott, they tend to turn into pipe bombs. So there's not really any safe place to stand near them. Now, in terms of works on naval ordnance in the 19th century, there's obviously the treatise on naval ordnance that actually is from around about the time of the American Civil War, which I've referenced before. Drop me an email or something if you want a copy of that particular PDF. If you're looking for Dahlgrens and Parrotts in particular, there's the big guns, Civil War, siege, seacoast, and naval cannon, although you will have to look for a second-hand copy, and good luck because it runs pretty expensive these days. Although if you know where to look, you can find cheaper copies. Dahlgren himself actually wrote a book called Shells and Shell Guns, although unfortunately it was published in the late 1850s prior to the American Civil War. But if you want a good idea of his foundation in guns, then that's probably a good one to pick up, and that one you can get for free because it's public domain now, although obviously it doesn't cover his Civil War stuff. Again, available for free because it is public domain. There is Great Guns, The Cause of Their Failures and the True Method of Constructing Them by Norman Weard, which is published in 1863, so that's middle of the American Civil War. There's a 2-volume set by Eugene Canfield called Civil War Naval Ordnance, and Dahlgren himself also wrote a memoir in 1882, which obviously will pick up on his later achievements after Shells and Shell Guns. And more recently, there's the development of Dahlgren's heavy cast iron smoothbores and their adoption by the Navy, which is a 1980s work. Again, that one might be a little bit hard to get hold of, but you can do so. And that wraps things up for this week. Thank you very much for listening, everybody, and I hope you've had a good day. Hopefully, I will continue to see you on other videos in the future. Thanks very much for listening. Bye for now.